Welcome to Wimmer's Wilderness. I'm your host, George Wimmer. I have 30 years of volunteer work, community organizing, and 16 years in local government, 12 of those as mayor. Wimmer's Wilderness is an informed look at politics, community, government, environment, and education from a local perspective. On this community update, and these are our shorter kind of mini little podcasts, that'll be 10 to 15 minutes or so. And of course, the first one I did, I think, was like half an hour because for those of you who know me or know me when I was in political office, you know, I could definitely talk. So we're going to cover zoning, which I know doesn't sound real exciting, but just hang with me for a few minutes here. A lot of places are changing their zoning. So just to kind of lay out the, kind of the roadmap of where we've been and where we're going. And again, this is something that's going to be on video on our platforms on Facebook and YouTube and little segments on TikTok and everywhere else. And then the podcast obviously will be on our Wimmer's Wilderness podcast as a community update kind of thing. So that's why people who watch the video, I'm not really going to look at you like I am now. I'm more interested in kind of talking about the topic. So anyway, zoning. Traditionally, you had, say, residential, you had 3, 4, 5 different tiers. You had R1, which is usually your biggest single family home type areas. R2, you can have some smaller homes. Also potentially R2 and then into R3, you can get into duplexes and quads and that type of thing in small like apartment buildings. And R4 is usually higher density, apartment buildings, condo units, that type of thing. The R just simply stands for residential. Then you have your commercial, your industrial, your mix, all that kind of thing. So it was pretty black and white. You're in this kind of zoning. Therefore, this is what you expect. This is what you have to build. This is what your neighbor's going to have to build. That's what you have. You have places like Houston, Texas, which is like the wild, wild west of zoning where there really isn't any. And there's lots, well, I don't want to say lots. There's a number of places that have really very limited or really zoning that's not enforced. Most places, however, do have it, very strict. You have to meet certain requirements or you just simply can't build that way. Or build there. And that can be from setbacks between your property. If you have a garage on your property, it has to be 10 feet or 15 feet or 5 feet from the property line, that type of thing. Impervious surface requirements, that means, the roofs and paved driveway and all that because it's a water runoff issue. And there's just tons of details that go into zoning. But the trend in the last few years has been to really mix that up, getting away from the concept of, this is the rich side of town, this is the poor side of town, and that we want to make sure that, okay, this area, these are where the starter homes are, these are where the apartments are, and not really mixing any of that up. You've seen in some of the higher density residential and light commercial areas where that's been mixing for quite a while, where you might have a condo or apartment building that has some commercial right in the property. And usually that's in, bigger communities, that type of thing. But you've seen a lot of that mixing. You've also seen apartment buildings next to light industrial or commercial. So you really have workforce housing close to where people are going to work. Okay, it kind of helps with the transportation issue. But you're getting more and more where communities are passing. And I read an article this morning where the Seattle City Council is changing their single family zoning name, but not necessarily the substance. So it's kind of interesting how they're going about it. But there are places where, you can have your ridiculous McMansion right next to a small starter home next to a multifamily home where they're putting everything kind of in one big pot. Some communities are kind of getting rid of specific zoning areas. Now, you used to kind of handle this. Well, you still do in most places. I shouldn't say you used to, but you had traditionally handled this by having PUDs, which was a planned unit development. So there you might have, a $500,000 or $1 million home, and then two houses down there might be a $150,000 home type thing. And obviously these numbers are skewed. Some places those numbers are really cheap, some places those numbers are really expensive, but overall you kind of get the picture where you'd have those types of variety of housing on the same street. Most communities hadn't developed that way. Well, now that you're kind of looking at, well, you don't want to have a community that's just all big homes and a community that's all just small homes. You want to have a good mix so that people can live in differing parts of a town and not have it be a requirement that you make, $300,000 to afford to live in the perceived good side of town. And this has huge impacts, positive impacts of, okay, well, this area is generally safer, or this area is generally has higher crime rates, or whatever kind of blanket statements you want to make. When you really mix things up that way, you can't, cast aspersions, nor can you, if, from a policing standpoint, say, okay, well, we're going to police this area and not that area. Having that kind of, well-rounded community may not be such a bad thing. Now, you have the old adage, you go into a neighborhood, you buy the smallest home in that neighborhood, and all the other homes kind of bring up its value. So when you have a starter home next to a much more expensive home, does that make that starter home that much more expensive, and therefore it's not really that kind of a good deal? Or do you have people who are going to want to invest a lot of money into a bigger home and have that value dragged down because maybe a number of the properties are smaller next to it? So there are some real world impacts that I don't think we have enough information on to decide if you are able to get enough interest in those communities. And like I said, Houston is one of those communities that's just never really had any kind of zoning. So there it seems to work. I don't know if that would work everywhere. And it's also one of those things where you go along and it takes a while to know if, gosh, I invest $400,000 in this home and there's two smaller homes here, or maybe even a manufactured home or a mobile home or whatever it might be. 20 years from now, am I going to get out of that home a decent return? And will that fear kind of short circuit a lot of these developments in the future? So it's a trend that I think has some legs, as a lot of communities are changing their actual planning and zoning ordinances to allow these types of things. In some cases, to force these kinds of changes and to look at instead of allowing neighborhoods to knock down old construction and then, build these massive homes that, most people wouldn't be able to afford, to make sure that there's affordable housing in those areas. So again, it's a trend that's occurring. It's going to have big impacts on our communities. It just is. Okay. When I was mayor in the city of Isani, we had workforce housing or affordable housing or whatever the euphemism is going to be used, because most of that community was lower cost housing. It just was organically. It's the way it was originally developed. And we needed to develop a little bit, bigger homes and homes that, would be paying a little bit higher property tax value, so we could afford the services that our community needed, along with bringing in industrial and commercial and all that kind of stuff. So you have to look at each community. Everybody's going to have a different take on it, but I think we need to make sure that we kind of have a consistent understanding. Every town, every city, every township, village, whatever it might be, should be able to experiment with this. So we don't want states saying, okay, you can't do this and you can't do that. We need to have that kind of, wonderful experimenting process going on, because each community is a little bit different. But I do think, kind of the fear or concern about this type of development is, will people who are investing in that home look at that as their greatest investment? Because that's kind of what the process had been for generations of, your biggest investment is in your home. And then at some point you'll be able to sell that at a decent return so that you have money for your future, for your retirement, for whatever it is that you're looking for. We need to really gather the information and not everybody go headlong in one direction. Because again, I'm not sure if it's going to be a successful model. I think from a societal standpoint, it's an awesome model. From a financial investment standpoint, I don't know if we have enough information to know if it will be a successful model in the majority of communities, or are we going to end up with properties that in 5 years from now are not going to really bring in the value that people are investing into it. So it's one of those things that, is it a fad? Is it a trend? I think it's more of a trend. I think it's going to continue to happen. I think it's societal based, needed to happen. Economically, we'll see how it all works out for everybody. But I think you also have to look at how those residential communities can't just be a standalone thing. And that's my last concern, and then we'll try to get this done in under 15 minutes, is that you have this being done on the residential side. You need to do things that are going to make it easier for people to quickly get to their employment, quickly get to where they may want to spend their money. So you have, these kind of maybe micro communities in some of these larger cities, where you have your work, play, and home all in a reasonable distance. Where I'm at, people are still going, anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes to get to where they work. That's not a long-term successful strategy. And even if you mix up the residential districts in a community, you still have all these other areas that need to be addressed. And I think that, if you look at the whole planning, the whole zoning ordinances together, then you might get a lot more successful outcomes, because a lot of those uses don't have to be so far apart. Okay. You should be able to live in one neighborhood, be within a very short distance of another, and be able to, have some recreation there as well. So that's all I'm going to say on this topic. We're going to talk next week on another one that has to do with education, and I hope you'll give me some feedback if you like these or not. Thanks for listening. Thank you for joining us today. Help us spread the word by telling your friends, family, and heck, even your frenemies that they can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Luminary, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, TuneIn Radio. Pretty much anywhere you can find a podcast, you're going to find Wimmer's Wilderness. To learn more about us, go to wimmerswilderness.org. Make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Wimmer's Wilderness.